I was chained beside an alien warrior now. She says we're mates. Welcome to the world of science fiction. Comment below where in the world you are watching from today. And if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. Jaxon Kane's head pounded like someone had taken a plasma wrench to his skull, and the taste of iron lingered in his mouth as he slowly regained consciousness. His arms were stiff, his shoulders screaming in protest as he shifted the cold bite of metal, cutting into his wrists, shackles thick, heavy, and bolted to the damp stone wall. Behind him the air was thick with the scent of sweat, rust, and something darker, blood. Maybe his vision swam as he blinked against the dim glow of flickering plasma torches lining the walls. It took him a few moments to realize where he was, but when he did, his gut twisted. This wasn't just any cell, it was a holding pit underground off the grid, a place where people weren't meant to leave alive. He flexed his fingers, testing his range of motion, his body sluggish from whatever sedative they used to drag him in here. He barely remembered the ambush. 1 minute, he was making an easy cargo run through the border sectors. The next, his ship was ripped out of hyperspace by a gravity snare. Pirates, he had assumed at first, but pirates usually had the courtesy of robbing you before tossing you into a death hole. The Goric warlords didn't bother with petty theft. They were slavers, pit masters, and entertainment brokers for the worst scum in the sector, which meant they hadn't captured him to steal his credits. They'd captured him to sell. A slow, measured exhale left his lips as he turned his head, scanning the cell, looking for anything, any weakness, any potential edge. And then he saw her. She was chained just like him, shackles digging into her wrists. But that was where their similarities ended. Even in the dim light, he could tell she was alien, not just any alien, a fighter, the kind that didn't just survive in places like this, but thrive. She sat with her legs crossed back, straight, her breathing controlled. The way her muscles tensed and relaxed told him she wasn't just waiting. She was assessing. Green skin, smooth and unmarred despite the rough conditions. Blue eyes, sharp and unflinching. Red bob-cut hair, a striking contrast against the grime of the dungeon. Even in change, she looked like she belonged in an arena. Jaxon swallowed hard. She was watching him too. You're awake, she said, her voice low, but carrying an edge of something unshakable. Not relief, not concern, just observation. Jaxon licked his lips, his throat dry. Yeah, for all the good it does me. She tilted her head slightly as if considering something before speaking. Again, what's your name, human? He could already tell answering her was less of a choice and more of a test. He wasn't about to act tough, not with his head still spinning and his limbs half numb. But he wasn't about to play weak either. Jaxon Kane, smuggler freelancer. He gave a humorless chuckle, currently unemployed. Something flickered across her expression, amusement, no more like calculation. Tor, she finally said, just the name, no extra details, which meant she was either hiding something or she figured he wasn't worth knowing. Jaxon rolled his shoulders against the wall, testing his restraints again. No give, not surprising. So Tayla, you seem like someone who's seen the inside of a pit before. He nodded toward the heavy door at the far end of the cell. You got a plan, or are we just waiting to die? Her lips pressed into a thin line, but he caught the flicker of something in her eyes. The ones who wait to die usually do. A beat of silence passed. Then she exhaled slowly. They took you because you're human. You'll sell well. Not many of your kind end up here, and novelty makes for good entertainment. Jaxon frowned. He'd heard the horror story about humans being bought and sold outside of protected space, but he never expected to land in the middle of one. And what about you? He asked. She didn't answer right away. Then they think I'm worth more alive. The way she said it made something cold settle in his gut. This wasn't just about survival for her. There was more to it, something she wasn't saying. He didn't push, not yet. Instead, he focused on the more immediate problem. So what's the deal? Are we thrown into fight until we drop dead, or do they auction us off first? Tor's fingers curled into fists, her jaw tightening. They'll test you, throw you in with a weaker opponent, see how much fight you have. If you last, they'll keep pushing you. If you break. She didn't need to finish the sentence. Jaxon let out a slow breath. He wasn't a fighter. He was fast, good with a blaster, better with words, but bare-knuckle survival against trained killers, that wasn't his game. And you? He asked. What's your angle in all this? She turned her head just enough to meet his gaze. I don't lose. That should have reassured him. It didn't. Footsteps heavy armored, approaching fast. Jaxon tensed as the reinforced door groaned open, spilling torchlight into the cell. 2 guards entered, towering brutes clad in patchwork armor, their tusked faces twisted in cruel amusement. One of them carried a stun baton, the other a set of thick iron collars. On your feet, fighters. The bigger one growled. Time to see what you're made of. Jaxon barely had time to react before rough hands hauled him up, the cold metal of the collar snapping around his neck with a sharp clink. Tayla didn't struggle as they did the same to her, but the look in her eyes, it was the look of a predator who had just spotted an opening. As they were dragged from the cell, Jaxon leaned closer to her, keeping his voice low. Tell me you've got something planned. She didn't look at him. Didn't need to. I do. Her voice was calm. But you're not going to like it. The collars around their necks tightened with an unnatural force, locking in place with a low hum of energy that made Jaxon's skin prickle. He'd seen these before, shock collars, high-grade ones designed to keep prisoners in line. One wrong move, one attempt to break free, and a surge of electricity would drop them like a stone. That wasn't the worst part, though. The real problem was that these things weren't just restraints, they were control mechanisms. If the warlords had a mind to, they could turn them up high enough to fry someone from the inside out. Jaxon clenched his jaw, keeping his breathing steady as the guards yanked him forward, his wrists still shackled in front of him. Tayla beside him moved without resistance, her gaze forward, unreadable. She didn't fight back, didn't struggle, didn't make a sound, and that more than anything set Jaxon on edge. They were led through a narrow corridor carved from rough stone, the flickering plasma torches casting long shadows along the damp walls. The sounds of the arena grew louder with each step, deep guttural cheers, the clash of metal against flesh, the sharp, agonized screams of fighters who hadn't been lucky enough to win their last match. Jaxon swallowed hard, pushing down the creeping unease twisting through his gut. He needed a plan. He needed something. Smuggling had always been about improvisation, about knowing when to talk your way out and when to run, but here there was nowhere to run, no fast ship waiting just outside, no backdoor deals to be made. The guards dragged them through a set of rusted iron gates, and suddenly they were in it. The pit was a brutal circle of packed dirt surrounded by jagged stone walls that stretched high above them. Spectators crowded the upper edges, a mix of warlords, criminals, and off-world scum, looking to bet credits on who would bleed first. The air was thick with the acrid scent of sweat, blood, and the sickly sweet aroma of alien stimulants. Jaxon barely had time to take it all in before a third guard, this one bigger than the other two, strode toward them, his grin sharp with malice. Fresh meat, the guard rumbled, his tusks gleaming under the torchlight. Let's see if you last longer than the last batch. He pulled something from his belt, a small control pad, and pressed a button. A sudden searing pain exploded in Jaxon's neck, his entire body locking up as electricity coursed through him. He gasped, muscles spasming, his knees threatening to buckle. He barely managed to stay upright, breathing hard through clenched teeth. Tayla beside him barely flinched. Jaxon saw her fists clench, saw the way her jaw tensed, but she took the pain without so much as a grunt. That wasn't normal. Either she'd felt worse, or she'd learned how to push through it. The guard laughed. You'll fight in pairs, he announced, turning his gaze to the crowd. Above, a test of instinct, of loyalty. Let's see how long these two last before one turns on the other. The spectators cheered at that, a vicious, eager roar that made Jaxon's stomach churn. That was the game. Then force them to fight together, watch them struggle, and see which one betrayed the other first. A heavy gate on the opposite side of the arena rumbled open, and from the darkness beyond, two figures emerged, their opponents. One was a hulking brute reptilian with thick, scaly skin that looked like it could turn aside a plasma bowl. The other was smaller, faster looking, with too many razor-sharp limbs and the kind of dead-eyed stare that told Jaxon this thing had killed before. Jaxon tensed, instinct screaming at him that they were outmatched. Tayla turned her head slightly toward him. Stay close, she murmured, just loud enough for him to hear. I'll handle the big one. Jaxon almost laughed. She'll handle the big one? Great. That left him with the lame death machine. He took a low breath. No weapons, no armor, just raw instinct, in the hope that Tayla actually knew what she was doing. The fight started fast. The reptilian lunged for Tayla first, its heavy clawed hands swinging in a wide, brutal arc. She was already moving before the attack even landed, slipping under its arm, her movements fluid, effortless. She wasn't just fast, she was calculating her body, adjusting mid-motion, twisting just enough to let the attack pass by without wasting any energy. Then in the same heartbeat, she struck back, a sharp kick to the side of the creature's knee, a brutal follow-up elbow to its throat. The thing staggered, choking, but didn't go down. Jaxon didn't have time to watch more. The other fighter was already on him, its limbs flashing like whips, moving with inhuman speed. Jaxon ducked just in time, the swipe missing his throat by inches. But before he could react, the thing was on him again. It was like fighting a storm, fast, unpredictable, no pattern to its movements. Jaxon did the only thing he could think of. He moved backward, forcing his opponent to close the distance faster, hopping to throw it off balance. It almost worked, almost, but the thing adapted, adjusting mid-strike. One of its razor-sharp limbs, slashing across Jaxon's arm, pain flared hot and sharp, and Jaxon hissed through his teeth. He barely had time to register the wound before the thing lunged again. But this time, Jaxon saw the opening, a brief moment where it had overextended just a fraction. He reacted on instinct, stepping into the attack instead of away from it, slamming his shackled fists into the thing's midsection. It let out a shriek and stumbled back just long enough for Jaxon to retreat and reset. Tayla's fight wasn't going much better. The reptilian brood had recovered fast, and now it was relentless, swinging heavy, crushing blows that would shatter bone if they connected. Tayla dodged, rolled, struck back where she could, but the thing had size and endurance on its side. Jaxon's pulse pounded. This wasn't going to work. They needed an edge. Tayla, Jaxon shouted, breathless. Switch. She didn't hesitate. In one smooth motion, she twisted away from the reptilian, ducked under its reach, and pivoted toward Jaxon's opponent. Instead, Jaxon didn't wait, didn't question it. He turned and threw himself at the brute, moving before his brain could tell him how stupid it was. He wasn't stronger than it, but he was faster. He dodged left, then faked right, throwing off its rhythm. When it swung, he moved first, aiming for the knees instead of the body, a smuggler's trick, a dirty move, but effective. The brute stumbled just long enough for Jaxon to land a second blow, then a third. It was working. Tayla, meanwhile, tore through the knife-lined creature like she'd been waiting for the challenge. 2 moves, and she had it on the ground. 3, and it wasn't getting up. The crowd roared, half in rage, half in awe. Jaxon barely had time to catch his breath before the announcer's voice boomed overhead. They live for now. The roar of the crowd still echoed in Jaxon's ears, a deafening mix of jeers, cheers, and drunken wagers being exchanged above his lungs. Burned as he struggled to steady his breathing, his pulse still hammering from the fight. Blood dripped from his arm, warm and sticky, but the wound wasn't deep enough to slow him down. His adrenaline was doing a good job of numbing most of the pain. For now, he had survived. They had survived. That was more than he had expected when he first stepped into the pit. But the reality of their situation was sinking in fast. The fight was over for now. That didn't mean they were free. That didn't mean the warlords were done with them. If anything, their survival had just made them more valuable. The guards stormed onto the battlefield, their boots crunching against the dirt as they moved toward Jaxon, and Tayla, one of them, shoved Jaxon forward, nearly knock him off his feet. His shackled wrists made it hard to catch his balance, and he barely managed to avoid going down face first. He felt the cold press of a stunned battalion against his ribs, a wordless warning not to resist, not that he needed the reminder. He had seen what happened to the fighters who tried to resist. The ones who fought back after the battle had ended didn't get dragged back to their cells. They were dragged to the meat pits. Tayla walked beside him, her face unreadable. She didn't look at him, didn't acknowledge him, but she moved with purpose. She had barely broken a sweat during the fight, and that fact alone sent a ripple of unease through Jaxon's gut. He had been fighting for his life. She had been calculating, observing, holding back just enough to stay in control. That meant something. She had a plan. He just didn't know what it was yet. The trek back to the cells was faster this time, the guards eager to clear the pit for the next round of bloodshed. The moment they reached their cell, The guard shoved them inside, the heavy iron gates slamming shut behind them. The locks clicked into place with an unsettling finality, and the flickering torches lining the walls cast their shadows long across the cold stone floor. Jaxon exhaled slowly, rolling his shoulders against the AC, settling deep into his muscles. He wasn't a fighter, but for a guy who spent most of his life talking his way out of danger, he hadn't done too bad. Tayla finally turned to him, her blue eyes sharp, assessing. "You kept up better than I expected," she said, her tone neutral. "But there was something else there, something almost approving." Jaxon smirked, but it was half-hearted. "I aimed to impress." He slid down against the wall, stretching out his legs with a groan. "You want to tell me what that was all about? The switch? You saw something I didn't?" Tayla crossed her arms, leaning against the opposite wall. "Your movements are untrained, but your instincts are good. You react fast, and you don't freeze under pressure." Her gaze flickered to his injured arm, then back to his face. "But you were outmatched. You wouldn't have lasted against that thing." Jaxon huffed. "Thanks for the vote of confidence." She didn't smile. "You're not a warrior, you're a strategist. You think first, you find angles. That's useful, more useful than pretending to be something you're not." Jaxon let that sit for a moment, watching her carefully. "So what's the play here, Tayla? You seem to have this all figured out." Something flickered in her expression, but it was gone too fast for him to read. "Survival isn't about brute force, it's about understanding the game. The warlords want a show, but they also want profit. We live today, which means they'll bet higher next time. That means we have a window to use." Jackson's brow furrowed. "Use for what?" Tayla hesitated for half a second, then escaped. Jaxon blinked. He hadn't expected her to say it out loud. He had hoped was thinking it, but now that she had actually confirmed it, a dozen questions flooded his mind at once. How and why now? But the biggest question of all, the one that knotted him the hardest, was how long had she been planning this? Because from the way she spoke, this wasn't a new idea. This was something she had been waiting for. He leaned forward, slightly lowering his voice. "You've got a plan." Tayla didn't confirm or deny it. "I have an opportunity, but it only works if you keep up." Jack narrowed his eyes. "You just said I'm not a warrior." "You don't have to be," she said. "Simply, you just have to be useful." Let out a slow breath, his mind racing. If she had something, if she really had a way out, then that was everything. But there was something off about the way she was looking at him, the way she was measuring him like a component in a machine, calculating whether he fit into whatever scheme she had already mapped out. He had spent years reading people, knowing when someone was feeding him half-truths or leaving out the most important detail. Tayla wasn't lying, but she wasn't telling him everything either. "You don't trust me," he said finally. Tayla tilted her head, as if considering. "Trust isn't given, it's earned." Jaxon snorted. "That's rich, coming from someone asking me to play along with a mystery plan." Tayla pushed off the wall, stepping closer, her eyes locked onto his with an intensity that made his skin prickle. "You want details? Fine. The warlords are moving high-value fighters off-world in the next rotation. It's a transfer to a bigger arena, different buyers, more money, more security. Once we're moved, escape gets a lot harder. We need to get out before that happens." Jackson's mind reeled. That changed everything. If they were being transferred, that meant time was running out. He ran a hand through his hair, exhaling through his nose. "All right, I'm listening. What do we have to do?" Tayla watched him for a long moment, then a small, almost imperceptible smirk pulled at the corner of her mouth. "We make them think we're bonded." Jaxon blinked. "I'm sorry." What? She didn't waver. "A warrior's bond, it's a sacred right. If the warlords believe it, they won't separate us. And if we're kept together, we control where we're moved." Jaxon stared at her. "You mean like a fake marriage?" Tayla raised an eyebrow. "If that's what makes it easier for you to understand, then yes." Jaxon let his head drop back against the wall, letting out a breathless laugh. "This just keeps getting better." Tayla's expression was unreadable again. "It has to look real," she said, voice quiet but firm. "Which means convincing them." Jaxon shook his head, a humorless grin tugging at his lips. "And how do we do that?" Tayla's blue eyes didn't waver. "You let me mark you." Jaxon let the word settle, his pulse drumming in his ears as he watched with a mix of wariness and disbelief. "Mark him?" That sounded way too permanent for something that was supposed to be a bluff. He had pulled plenty of scams in his life, but none that involved branding his body for the sake of an escape plan. He didn't like the sound of it, didn't like the way She was looking at him like she had already decided for both of them. But what choice did he really have? He could refuse, sure, but then what? Get thrown back into the pit, keep fighting until his body finally gave out? No, if Taylor had a way out of this, he needed to hear it. He needed to understand exactly what the hell he was signing up for. He rubbed the back of his neck where the weight of the shock collar still pressed uncomfortably against his skin. All right, he said, exhaling slowly. I'll bite. What does this marking thing actually involve? Taylor didn't blink. A warrior's bond isn't just words, it has to be physical. My kind don't take it lightly. A mark is proof of unity, a symbol of loyalty to them. It's unbreakable. Jaxon narrowed his eyes. And if they believe it, they don't separate us. Exactly. Something about the way she said it made his gut twisted. Was too easy. There had to be a catch. What happens after he pressed, let's say we convinced them? What then? You think they're just going to let us waltz out of here because they think we're a happy little warrior couple? Taylor's jaw tightened. No, but it puts us in the right position. It means they trust we won't be a risk. Fighters with bonds don't break as easily. They don't run because they fight for each other. If they believe we're bound, they'll move us together. That gives us control over the when and where of our escape. Jaxon considered that, tapping his fingers against his knee. It was a long shot, but long shots were all they had. If she was right, then the bond wasn't just about keeping them together. It was about lowering their captor guard. He had bluffed his way out of plenty of bad situations before, but this was different. This wasn't just a lie. It was something deeper, something that had weighed in a way he wasn't sure he could fake. Still, he knew what the alternative was: the arena, the endless fights, the certainty of dying down here. If he didn't do something, he blew out of breath. Fine. Let's say I'm in. How do we make it look real? Taylor stepped closer, dropping into a crouch in front of him, her gaze locked onto his. I leave a mark on your skin, she said, her voice low. It has to be deep enough that it doesn't fade. That's what makes it official. Jaxon swallowed. And how do you do that? She tilted her head, the dim torchlight casting sharp shadows over her green skin. I bite. He stared at her. Of course she bites. Why wouldn't she? Or serious? She didn't react to his sarcasm. It has to be done in front of them. It has to look like I'm claiming you. Jaxon ran a hand down his face. Great. So I just let you sink your teeth into me in front of an audience? That's the plan. Taylor's gaze didn't waver. Unless you have a better one. He didn't. And that was the problem. He let out a slow breath, nodding more to himself than to her. All right, let's get this over with. Taylor didn't move immediately. She watched him for another long moment, her expression unreadable. Then, with a sharp tilt of her chin, she stood and moved to the iron gate, rapping her knuckles against it. The sound echoed down the stone corridor, drawing the attention of the guards stationed outside. When the gate swung open, one of them, a broad-shouldered brute with tusks jutting from his lower jaw, stepped inside, his beady yellow eyes sweeping over them. What do you want, fighter? He grunted. Taylor stood tall, shoulders squared, her presence commanding even in chains. I want an audience with the pit master. The guard snorted. And why would he waste time on you? Taylor didn't flinch. Because I'm claiming my mate. A hush settled over the small space, the weight of those words making Jaxon's skin prickle. The guard's grin curled, slow and cruel, but there was interest in his expression now. You think he cares about your little warrior games? The guard sneered. Taylor met his gaze without hesitation. He cares about keeping his fighters controlled. Bonded mates don't run, they don't betray each other, they survive. If I claim him, he's mine. That means he fights harder. It means you make more money. The guard's grin widened, amusement flickering across his face. And the human agrees to this. He turned to Jaxon, eyes glinting with something between curiosity and malice. You want to be her pet, little man? Jaxon exhaled through his nose, keeping his expression neutral. He hated playing into this, hated giving them even a second of entertainment. But if this was how they got out, then so be it. He lifted his chin and met the guard's stare. I want to survive. The guard let out a sharp bark of laughter. Oh, this is rich. The pit master going to love this. He turned, motioning to the other guards outside. Take them to the viewing hall. Let's see this warrior bond for ourselves. The moment the guards moved to unshackle them, Taylor shot Jaxon a look, brief, unreadable, but heavy with something he couldn't quite place. Then they were being led through the corridors again, but this time, instead of being dragged toward another fight, They were being marched to an audience. The viewing hall was built above the main pit, a place where the warlords and high rollers of the underground fights could enjoy their exclusive entertainment. The pit master himself sat at the center, a massive creature draped in ceremonial armor, his many ringed fingers drumming against the stone armrest of his throne. His gaze swept over Jaxon and Tayla with bored indifference. The guard who had escorted them stepped forward, bowing slightly. The gladiatrix wishes to claim her mate, he announced. A slow, amused chuckle rumbled from the pit master's chest. Does she now? His gaze landed on Tayla. Go on. Then prove it. Jaxon barely had time to brace himself before Tayla turned to him, her blue eyes locking onto his, and then in one fluid motion she grabbed his arm, pulled him close, and sank her teeth into his skin. The pain was sharp and immediate, a flash of heat spreading from the point of contact as her teeth dug in just deep, enough to leave a mark. Jaxon clenched his jaw, forcing himself not to react, not to flinch. He had to sell this. He had to look like this was real. When Tayla finally pulled back, blood welled from the fresh imprint of her bite, vivid against his skin. She lifted her chin, meeting the pit master's gaze. He is mine, she said, her voice steady. Silence. Then, after a long drawn-out pause, the pitmaster smiled. Very well, he said, his voice thick with amusement. Let's see if your bond holds when the real games begin. Jaxon's arm still throbbed from Tayla's bite, a dull, insistent ache that pulsed with every beat of his heart. He could feel the slow trickle of blood running down his skin, warm against the cold, damp air of the underground fighting pit. The wound wasn't deep enough to cause any real damage, but it was there, a fresh mark that stood as undeniable proof of what had just happened. The pitmaster watched with thinly veiled amusement, his heavy rings clicking against the armrest of his throne. As he studied them, Jaxon forced himself to stand tall, to keep his expression unreadable despite the sharp sting still burning in his flesh. This was the part where the real gamble began. The bite was one thing, it got them an audience, made the warlords believe their bond was real, but words and gestures only went so far. Now they had to prove it. The pitmaster finally leaned forward, his amusement shifting into something colder, sharper. A warrior's bond is sacred among your kind, isn't it? He mused, his voice a deep rumble that carried through the stone chamber. His eyes flicked between Tayla and Jaxon, as if weighing them against each other. A connection that cannot be broken. If that's true, then I assume you're both willing to fight for it, to bleed for it, to die for it. Jaxon's stomach twisted. He had expected something like this, had known from the start that they wouldn't just be able to say they were bonded and walk away unchallenged. But hearing the words out loud, seeing the anticipation in the warlord's eyes, made it feel real, in a way that no amount of planning could have prepared him for. He didn't need to look at Tayla to know she wasn't surprised. She had expected this too. Maybe she had even counted on it. Tayla inclined her head slightly, her posture calm, steady. A bond means nothing if it's not tested, she said simply. The warlord grinned. Then, let's put it to the test. A murmur rippled through the surrounding warlords and spectators, the sound of credits being exchanged, bets being placed. Jaxon's pulse quickened, his muscles tensing as the guards moved forward, once more grabbing his arms and hauling him away from Tayla. Before he could react, she didn't resist as they did the same to her. But the moment their chains were pulled in opposite directions, a low growl rumbled in her throat, a sound that was just real enough to sell the illusion. It wasn't anger, wasn't even frustration, it was territorial, the kind of instinctive reaction that would make anyone watching believe she meant it. They were dragged toward the pit once more, but this time the setup was different. Instead of another standard brawl, the floor of the arena had shifted, revealing a deep trench in the center, lined with jagged metal spikes. Above it, a narrow stone beam stretched across the gap, a path barely wide enough for one person to stand on. At either end of the beam stood two warriors, opponents. The crowd roared as the meaning became clear. This wasn't just a fight, it was a trial. The pitmas rose from his seat, extending a hand toward them. Your bond will be tested in the trial of the twin blades, he announced. One of you fights, the other remains unarmed. If your bond is true, you'll find a way to survive together. If it's not, his grin widened, flashing sharp teeth, well, gravity will decide the rest. Jaxon barely had time to process before he was shoved forward, his feet hitting the packed dirt floor As the guards forced him toward the edge of the pit, Tayla was pushed beside him. Her hands still bound, her body tense, but composed. He shot her a quick look, trying to read her, but she was already focused on the beam, on the warriors waiting at the other end. "You fight," she murmured, just loud enough for him to hear. "I guide." Jaxon tensed. "You what? You heard me," she said, her voice calm despite the situation. "You hold the blades, I hold your focus." That was insane. He wasn't a fighter. He had survived their last match by dodging, improvising, letting Tayla take control of the fight. But now she was asking him to take the lead. His mouth went dry as a pair of curved blades were thrust into his hands. Shorter than traditional swords, designed for close combat, their edges gleaming under the torchlight. He barely had time to adjust his grip before the guards unchained Tayla's hands and pulled her back. She wasn't thrown into the pit. She was forced to stand at the edge, shackled once more, left to watch. Jaxon's heart slammed against his ribs. If he lost this fight, he didn't just die, she did too. The warlord raised a hand, and with a sharp downward slash the fight began. Jaxon barely had time to lift his blades before the first opponent was on him, a towering brute with scarred gray skin, a weapon swinging in a brutal arc toward his head. He dodged just in time, the air slicing past his cheek as he twisted his body, trying to find footing on the unstable beam. The second opponent was already moving, closing in from behind. Too fast. Jaxon had to move. "Tilt your stance," Tayla's voice cut through the chaos. "Sharp, steady, lower your center of gravity." Jaxon didn't question it. He couldn't. He adjusted, bending his knees, shifting his weight forward. Just as the first opponent swung again, this time he parried the impact, jolting up his arms, but keeping him upright. The second opponent lunged, but Jaxon saw the opening now, saw what Tayla had noticed before he moved first. He ducked, spinning low as the second opponent overextended his own momentum, carrying him forward too far. Jaxon lashed out, with the blade striking hard against the back of the warrior's knee. A choked cry split the air as the warrior lost his balance, and then he was falling. The crowd erupted as the warrior plummeted, his body hitting the spikes below with a sickening crunch. One down. The first opponent snarled, rage fueling his movements as he charged again. But this time Jaxon wasn't guessing. He wasn't just reacting, he was listening. "Wait for it," Tayla said, her voice cutting through the roar of the crowd. Reckless. "He'll leave an opening." Jaxon gritted his teeth, forcing himself to hold steady, even as his instincts screamed at him to move. The opponent swung again, a heavy, powerful slash meant to take Jaxon's head clean off. Now Tayla snapped. Jaxon dropped into a crouch, the blade whistling over his head. And with a sharp pivot, he thrust his sword forward, driving the point straight into the warrior's side. The warrior staggered. Jaxon didn't hesitate. One final strike. The opponent wavered, and then fell. The arena went wild. Jaxon barely had time to process it before he was being hauled off the beam, shoved to the ground. As the guards moved in, he turned his head toward Tayla. She was smiling, not in amusement, not in triumph, but in recognition. He had won. They had doubted, and now their captors believed it. Jaxon barely had time to catch his breath before the guards were on him again, yanking him up from the blood-stained ground, his arms wrenched behind him. His body was still buzzing with adrenaline, muscles tight from the fight, but his mind was clearer than it had been since this nightmare began. He had won against all odds, against every instinct telling him he wasn't a warrior. He had taken down 2 trained fighters and stayed on the beam. He had survived, but survival wasn't enough. Not here, not now. The warlord's laughter rumbled from above, low, amused, the sound of a man thoroughly entertained. Jaxon barely managed to keep himself upright as one of the guards slammed a fist into his stomach, knocking the wind out of him before hauling him forward. Tayla was being dragged too, her feet barely skimming the ground, her body tense but controlled. She wasn't fighting them, she wasn't resisting, not yet. Impressive. The pit master drawled, his voice carrying over the arena. He gestured lazily toward Jaxon. "The humans got more fight in him than I expected. You made a fine bet, warrior." His eyes flicked to Tayla, and Jaxon saw the calculation in them, the gears turning behind his smug expression. He wasn't convinced yet, not completely. Tayla met his gaze without flinching. "A bond is strength," she said, her voice steady. "He fought because he is mine. That is what you wanted to see, isn't it?" The pit master smirked. "Perhaps, But words and tricks mean little here. You know that he leaned forward, clasping his thick fingers together. I wonder if I were to put that bond to a real test, would it hold? Jaxon's jaw tightened. He knew exactly where this was going. The fight had been just another layer of entertainment for these sadistic bastards. They didn't just want to see him, Tayla, struggle. They wanted to see how far they would go, how much pain they would endure, how deep their so-called bond actually ran. And that meant this wasn't over, not by a long shot. The pitmaster snapped his fingers, and another set of guards stepped forward, carrying something heavy between. Then Jaxon's stomach turned. The second he saw it, a metal frame, curved restraints, the unmistakable shimmer of a pain induction system woven through its structure, a torture rack. Jaxon clenched his fists, the weight of reality settling over him like a vice. This was the real test he had barely scraped by in the arena. But this was different. He could fight, he could dodge, he could outmaneuver opponents, but pain, that was something else. Tayla didn't move as the guards positioned the device in the center of the chamber, didn't even react as the pitmaster gestured toward Jaxon. Your mate fought well, the warlord mused, but let's see how much he can endure. The guards forced Jaxon forward, their grips unrelenting as they shoved him toward the contraption. His mind raced, every nerve screaming at him to think, to find a way out. But there was no way out. He was outnumbered, outmatched. If he fought back now, they'd just beat him unconscious and strap him down anyway. No, he had to play the game. That was the only way. He exhaled sharply as the cold metal pressed against his back, as his arms were yanked above his head and locked into place, restraints clamped around his wrists, his ankles pinning him spread eagle against the frame. The warlord stood, making a slow descent down toward him, dragging out the moment, savoring the tension. The crowd above was waiting, hungry for a spectacle. Jaxon could feel their eyes on him, the energy of expectation, the thrill of watching someone break. Tayla still hadn't moved. The pitmaster turned to her, his expression full of mockery. If your bond is real, warrior, then you want to spare him, won't you? He motioned toward a guard who stepped forward and placed a long curved blade into her hands. Cut him loose, take the pain for him, or watch him suffer. Jaxon's breath hitched. That bastard. That was the real test, not just endurance, not just pain. They wanted to see if Tayla would break first, if she cared enough to take his place, if she would sacrifice for him. Jaxon locked eyes with her, something sharp twisting in his gut. She wasn't looking at the weapon, she wasn't looking at the pitmaster, she was looking at him. And he realized in that moment that whatever game she had been playing before, whatever calculation had been behind her choices, was gone, because this wasn't something she had planned for. This wasn't part of the escape. This was real. She took a slow breath, rolling her shoulders back, her grip tightening on the blade, and then she laughed. The sound was low, dangerous, curling at the edges with something almost amused. The pitmaster raised an eyebrow, intrigued. But Tayla only smiled, shaking her head slightly, as if she found the whole thing absurd. You're wasting your time, she said, her tone almost casual. Pain isn't the test you think it is. The warlord smirked. Tayla took a step forward, and for the first time since this entire mess started, Jaxon felt something shift, not just in the atmosphere of the chamber, not just in the tension between them and the pitmaster, but in her. She wasn't just reacting, she was choosing. She turned the blade in her hand, tilting it so the sharp edge caught the dim torchlight. If you wanted to see weakness, she said smoothly, you should have picked someone else. And then she cut herself. Jaxon's breath caught as she pressed the blade against her own palm, drawing a slow, deliberate line across her skin.